The night the cameras didn't blink. Before we dive into this story, welcome. You've just stepped into a case so tense, so unsettling, that once you start watching, it refuses to let go. If you're drawn to the truth hidden behind flashing lights and official silence, you're in the right place. And if you want stories that don't look away when things get dark, now is the time to like, subscribe, and leave a comment, because what you're about to hear is only the beginning. And here's the hook that will keep you till the very end. Every government agency said this case was open and shut. Every witness said it was anything but. And one piece of video, just 12 seconds long, may prove they were lying. The first gunshot didn't sound like it belonged in the city. It cracked through the winter air of South Minneapolis like a snapped tree branch, sharp and final, echoing between brick storefronts and frozen sidewalks. It was just after 9:40 p.m. at the corner of 24th Street and Nicollet Avenue, a place known more for late-night food runs and bus stops than federal raids and blood on the pavement. People turned. Phones came out. And a moment that should have vanished into rumor instead became something far more dangerous. A permanent record. A man was already on the ground when most cameras started rolling. His jacket was dark, his breath visible in pale clouds as he tried, and failed, to push himself upright. Around him, at least 3 men in tactical gear moved fast, boots scraping on ice, voices raised but indistinct. Someone shouted a command. Another voice, closer to the camera, screamed, "They shot him." That man would later be identified as Preddy. And within minutes, his name would be everywhere. By midnight, the clips were already spreading, raw, shaky, grainy, but undeniable. A bystander video showed agents grappling with Preddy, forcing him against a parked sedan. Another clip, allegedly from an ICE body camera, captured the moment a hand reached toward his waistband and the instant that followed, when the street exploded into chaos. Federal officials moved quickly to shape the story. They said it was a lawful operation. They said the man was resisting. They said the use of force was justified. But what they didn't say was why local police had been blocked from the scene for nearly an hour. They didn't say why state investigators were told to stand down. And they definitely didn't explain why a second shooting, involving another man named Good, had occurred just miles away, under eerily similar circumstances, within the same week. For the people who lived there, it didn't feel like coincidence. It felt like a pattern. The city that night was wrapped in a deceptive calm. Snow dulled the sound of traffic, streetlights reflected off slick pavement, and the smell of fried food drifted from a nearby corner shop as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But in that quiet, something had shifted. Because Minneapolis had seen violence before. What it hadn't seen was violence that arrived in unmarked vehicles, carried federal badges, and left with more questions than answers. At the center of the growing storm stood one woman who didn't mean to become part of the story. Her name was Lila Moreno. She had been waiting for the bus when she heard the shouting. Her first instinct was to look away, like so many people do when trouble breaks out in public. But then she heard the gunshot. Then another. And suddenly, her phone was in her hand, recording before her mind had even caught up. Later, when reporters found her, she would say something that haunted everyone who heard it. "I didn't feel like I was filming something. I felt like something was filming through me." Her video, just under 40 seconds long, became one of the most shared clips related to the case. It didn't show the first shot. It didn't show who pulled the trigger. But it showed what came after, and sometimes, that's what matters most. It showed agents backing away. It showed blood pooling on white snow. And it showed the crowd growing, not in anger at first, but in disbelief. Because disbelief is always the first stage. The next morning, headlines were careful. Federal agents involved in officer-involved shooting. Man injured in ICE operation. Neutral words for something that felt anything but neutral to the people who watched it happen. Then came the press conference. A single podium. A carefully worded statement. No questions about the video. The spokesperson spoke of protocol and active investigations. They reminded the public that body camera footage could not yet be released. They urged patience. They urged trust. But trust is fragile when cameras don't match the story being told. And it cracked even further when news broke about the second shooting. This time, the man's name was Good. Different neighborhood. Different night. Same outcome. A federal operation, a man shot, and a cloud of silence afterward. Good's shooting didn't go viral the way Pretty's did. There were fewer cameras. Fewer witnesses. But the details that emerged were enough to unsettle even the most skeptical observers. Reports of a struggle. Reports of a sudden movement. Reports of an immediate use of lethal force. 2 men. 2 incidents. 1 agency. People began to connect dots that officials refused to acknowledge. Community leaders called for transparency. Civil rights attorneys demanded the release of all footage. Local law enforcement quietly expressed frustration at being kept outside investigations happening on their own streets. And somewhere inside the federal system, doors began to close. Records that should have been public became under review. Requests that should have been routine were delayed. And sources who initially spoke freely suddenly stopped returning calls. It was as if the case itself had gone underground. But stories like this don't disappear. They transform. In small apartments and crowded diners, people rewatched the videos frame by frame. They slowed them down. They zoomed in. They argued about hand positions, body angles, shadows on the pavement. Amateur analysts became relentless investigators, finding patterns professionals had either missed or avoided. And one of them found something no one was supposed to notice. In the alleged ICE body cam clip, the one that surfaced anonymously on a forum before being mirrored across multiple platforms, there was a reflection. For just a split second, in the glass of a storefront window, you could see more than the agents. More than Pretty. More than the chaos. You could see a fourth figure. Standing back. Not intervening. Not shouting commands. Just watching. This figure did not appear in any official report. No badge number. No mention. No explanation. When that frame began circulating online, the tone of the conversation shifted. This was no longer just about whether a shooting was justified. It became about who else was there and why they were never acknowledged. Journalists tried to trace the origin of the body cam footage. It didn't come through official channels. It wasn't released by IC. It appeared as if someone had leaked it, risking their career or worse. And leaks like that usually happen for one reason. Someone believes the truth is being buried. By the end of the week, protests filled the streets near the shooting site. Candles flickered where blood had once darkened the snow. Photos of Pretty and Good were taped to lampposts, surrounded by handwritten messages. We deserve answers. Release the footage. Who is the fourth man? Federal officials remained silent. And that silence spoke louder than any statement. Because when institutions that are designed to explain themselves choose instead to hide, it tells you something is wrong, not just with the case, but with the system handling it. Then came the discovery that changed everything. A local journalist, digging through dispatch logs and internal call records, found a discrepancy. On the night Pretty was shot, there was a call logged to a private number, not a federal office, not local police, but a number traced to a private security contractor that had previously worked with IC on sensitive operations. That contractor was not mentioned anywhere in the official timeline. No press release. No acknowledgement. No explanation. And suddenly, the question was no longer just what happened at 24th and Nicollet. The question became, who else was involved, and what were they really doing there? Because when they finally traced that number and uncovered who answered that call, it led them to a locked facility on the edge of the city, a place that wasn't on any map and wasn't supposed to exist at all. And when investigators demanded access to what was inside, everything about this case changed. The facility that wasn't there. Before we go any deeper, let me pause you right here, because what you're about to hear is the part of the story most viewers don't make it to, and it's exactly where the truth begins to surface. If you want content that doesn't stop at headlines, that digs into what they'd rather you ignore, hit like right now so this story reaches people who still believe in real investigations. And if stories like this pull you in, subscribe, because the next one is even darker. And one more thing, while you're watching, comment where you're from. This story may have happened in Minnesota, but the questions it raises belong to all of us. The facility sat at the edge of the city like a forgotten scar. No sign. No address visible from the road. Just a long stretch of chain-link fencing, topped with coils of dull silver wire that caught the winter light like frozen lightning. It wasn't on any public registry. It didn't appear on zoning maps. When reporters tried to plug its coordinates into real estate databases, nothing came up, as if the building had been erased before it was ever meant to be seen. And yet, according to internal call records, that was where the mysterious number led. A private security contractor, working in coordination with IC, on operations labeled sensitive. That word, sensitive, has a way of swallowing entire truths. The journalist who uncovered it, Marcus Reed, was not new to stories that made people uncomfortable. He'd built his career on cases that fell between agencies, between jurisdictions, between responsibility. But this was different. This felt deliberate. He drove past the facility one evening just before sunset. There were no guards visible from the road. No patrol cars. No official signage. But the cameras were there, dark, bulbous shapes mounted high on steel poles, silently tracking every movement. Even from a distance, Marcus could feel it. This was not an abandoned place. It was a place meant not to be found. When he tried to get closer, he didn't make it past the first gate. A voice crackled through a speaker he hadn't seen, calm and unmistakably rehearsed. "You're on restricted property. Turn around." No name. No badge. Just a command. That night, Marcus published what he had. Not accusations. Not conclusions. Just facts. The call logs, the missing records, the existence of a facility no one would publicly claim. And within hours, the reaction was explosive. Online forums lit up. Activists demanded answers. And suddenly, everyone was asking the same question. Why would a federal agency rely on a private contractor, off the books, in operations that ended with civilians shot? This is the moment I need you to do something simple but powerful. Share this story. Stories like this survive because people pass them on. If this makes you uneasy, it should, and that discomfort is exactly why it needs to be seen. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted. City officials demanded briefings. State investigators renewed their requests for access to evidence. And for the first time since the shootings, federal representatives agreed to a closed-door meeting. What emerged from that meeting wasn't clarity, it was contradiction. They claimed the facility was used only for logistical support. They denied it had any role in field decisions. They refused to name the contractor, citing national security. But national security has long been the curtain behind which inconvenient truths disappear. Then came the leak. Not a video this time. A document. It was an internal memo, circulated just days before the Preddy shooting, outlining a pilot program involving rapid response teams composed of federal agents and private operatives. The language was cold, clinical, stripped of humanity. But one line stood out like a wound. Engagement protocols may supersede local jurisdictional coordination when time sensitivity outweighs procedural compliance. In simpler terms, act first, explain later, or never. Suddenly, the fourth figure in the reflection made sense. Not IC, not local law enforcement, but something in between. Or worse, something outside the system entirely. The public response shifted from anger to something deeper, fear. Because once you accept that armed operations are being conducted beyond public accountability, the question is no longer about one shooting or even two. It becomes about how many more we haven't seen. And just as this realization began to spread, something happened that nearly derailed the entire investigation. Marcus Reed vanished. Not dramatically. Not with headlines screaming his name. He simply stopped responding. His last message to a colleague was sent at 11:37 p.m. 2 words, "They know." The next morning, his apartment was empty. No signs of struggle. No packed bags. Just his laptop, open on the kitchen table, displaying a paused video file labeled, "Nicolette, alternate angle." That file would become the most dangerous piece of evidence in the case. When technicians finally accessed it, what they saw made the official story impossible to defend. The footage showed the moments before the shooting from a perspective no one had seen, from across the street, elevated, steady. Preddy was not lunging, not charging, not even facing the agents when the first shot was fired. He was turning away. And behind him, partially obscured, stood that fourth figure, raising an arm, not toward Preddy, but toward the agents. A signal. This wasn't a chaotic encounter spiraling out of control. It was something directed. Now pause for a second. If that makes your stomach tighten, if that changes how you see this entire case, drop a comment. I read them all, and your voice is part of why stories like this don't disappear quietly. Within hours of this footage being shared among a small circle of journalists and attorneys, servers hosting mirrored copies were taken down. Links broke. Accounts were suspended. It was as if an invisible hand swept across the internet, erasing traces as fast as they appeared. But erasure only works when people don't notice. And people noticed. Protests grew louder. Not just in Minneapolis now, but in other cities, other states. Signs no longer asked for answers. They demanded them. Who gave the signal? Who is the fourth man? What are they hiding? Yet the deeper investigators went, the more resistance they faced. Witnesses recanted. Sources withdrew. Even sympathetic officials began choosing their words carefully, as if every sentence carried unseen consequences. And still, one question hung in the air like smoke that refused to clear. If Preddy's shooting was directed, what about goods? Because patterns, once seen, cannot be unseen. As analysts began reviewing what little footage existed from the second incident, subtle similarities emerged. Timing, positioning, even the posture of the agent's moments before shots were fired. Not identical, but not random either. Which leads us to the most chilling possibility of all. These were not isolated tragedies. They were rehearsals. And whatever was being rehearsed wasn't over yet. Because while the public argued, while agencies denied, while journalists vanished and footage disappeared, someone else was quietly preparing the next operation, one that would make the first two shootings look like warnings. And in this you'll discover exactly who that was, what they were planning, and why the final truth behind the Minnesota ICE shootings is far more dangerous than anyone imagined. If this story has you hooked, now is the moment. Subscribe, stay with me, and don't look away. Because the ending of this case is not something you're ready for, but you need to hear it. The signal no one was supposed to hear. Before we cross the final line of this story, pause for 1 second. If you've stayed this far, you're not here for noise, you're here for truth. Tap like now so this story reaches people who still care about what happens behind closed doors. And if you want more investigations that don't flinch, subscribe, because what I'm about to reveal is exactly why this channel exists. Also, drop a comment with one word that describes how this story has made you feel so far. One word. Let's see if we're feeling the same thing. By the time authorities realized they could no longer control the narrative had already escaped them. The protests had shifted from candles and signs to something sharper, organized, focused, relentless. Independent journalists, civil rights lawyers, and digital analysts formed an uneasy alliance, sharing fragments of data like puzzle pieces rescued from a fire. Every erased link was re-uploaded. Every silenced account was replaced by 3 new ones. And somewhere in that rising storm, a name began to surface. Not the fourth man's name. Not yet. But the name of the program. Project Northbound. It wasn't listed in any public budget. It wasn't acknowledged in any congressional hearing. But traces of it existed, buried in procurement records, tucked into vague grant descriptions, hidden behind the language of infrastructure support and interagency readiness. Northbound wasn't designed for arrests. It was designed for control. A legal gray zone where federal authority blurred into private force, where accountability dissolved into contracts and clauses. It allowed rapid deployments, bypassed standard oversight, and, most critically, operated on the assumption that public scrutiny was a vulnerability. In other words, the fewer people who knew, the better it worked. And then something happened that no one inside the program had planned for. Someone inside broke. It began with a single encrypted message sent to a civil rights attorney in Chicago. No name. No greeting. Just a line of text and a file attached. They're preparing another operation. This one will not be hidden. The file was a logistical outline, routes, timelines, coordination points. Not enough to pinpoint a location, but enough to confirm one terrifying fact: northbound wasn't shutting down. It was expanding. The goal was no longer quiet removals or controlled encounters. The language had changed. Now it spoke of demonstrative presence and strategic visibility, which meant only one thing: they were ready to be seen. This is where I need you to lean in. If this story has made you question anything about how power operates, share it. Stories like this live or die by whether people pass them on. And if you're still watching, you already know this isn't just entertainment, it's a mirror. As the message circulated through trusted circles, something extraordinary happened. For the first time, the movement had the advantage of time. Instead of reacting after another tragedy, they could act before one. Analysts mapped the possible sites based on the routes. Lawyers prepared emergency injunctions. Journalists coordinated releases so no single takedown could erase the story again. And then at 3:12 a.m. on a freezing Thursday, the final piece arrived. A video. Not of a shooting. Not of an arrest. But of a briefing. Shot from the back of a room, slightly elevated, the footage showed a group of men and women in tactical gear standing before a digital map. Their faces were partially obscured, but their voices were clear. Visibility is part of the deterrent, one voice said. We move fast, we move publicly, and we move without hesitation. Then the voice that froze everyone who heard it. If there is resistance, escalation is authorized. We will not hesitate the way we did in Minnesota. Not if. That single sentence detonated what little credibility remained. Within hours of the video's controlled release, mainstream outlets could no longer ignore it. Officials scrambled. Statements contradicted each other. And for the first time, federal representatives were forced into open hearings. Under oath. No rehearsed podium speeches. No silent denials. And slowly, painfully, the truth emerged, not in one confession, but in fractures. Yes, a private contractor had been involved. Yes, oversight had been limited. Yes, operational authority had been blurred. But the most damning admission came from a single phrase, spoken quietly by a senior official who thought no one would catch it. We believed the public would never see those decisions. That was the moment everything changed. Because once the public sees, it cannot unsee. Project Northbound was suspended within days. Contracts were terminated. Reviews were launched. And while no one stood on a stage and declared victory, the silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer the silence of hiding. It was the silence of retreat. But the story didn't end there. Stories like this never do. Months later, a quiet update appeared buried on page 8 of a major paper. Charges had been filed against a private security executive for falsifying operational records related to federal deployments. The language was careful. The details minimal. But it confirmed what so many had feared and fought for. The shootings in Minnesota were not isolated tragedies. They were symptoms of a system stretched beyond its moral limits. Pretty and good became more than names. They became markers, the point where secrecy collided with sunlight. And then came the final twist. The anonymous source, the one who leaked the last video, revealed themselves, not in public, but in a handwritten letter sent to 3 different journalists. The letter ended with these words: I didn't speak out because I wanted to destroy the program. I spoke out because I didn't want to become it. That letter was never officially verified. But no one ever denied it either. Which brings us here. To you. Watching. Listening. Deciding what this story means. Because the real ending of this case isn't written in court documents or press releases. It's written in what happens next. In whether stories like this fade, or whether they change how power is allowed to move in the dark. If this story stayed with you, if it made you pause, question, or even feel uncomfortable, then do one last thing for me: subscribe. Not for me, for the stories that still haven't found their way into the light. They thought the truth would disappear once the cameras stopped rolling. They were wrong. And if you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one.